All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the launch event of our latest paper, which is a joint collaboration between the Bertelsmann Foundation and the Center for European Reform. My name is Lucas Carvalho. I'm a project manager at the Europe's Future program at the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and alongside John Springford, sits over there, associate fellow at the Center for European Reform. And our very esteemed panel, which I will introduce shortly. We will discuss why and how cities must drive growth within the single market, and in particular, the crucial implications of that for EU regional policy and cohesion policy in particular, in order to unlock these potentials. So before I introduce our speakers, let me just assure you that we have allocated plenty of time for your questions. You can post them at the end. We have a dedicated Q&A. And for everybody watching online, you can post the questions in the chat throughout our discussion, and we will get back to them then. So I'm joined on this panel by first Peter Berkowitz, Director for Policy at the Directorate-General for Regional and Urban Policy at the European Commission. Then we have Cinzia Alcidi, I hope I got that right, Director of Research and Head of Economics and Jobs and Skills Unit at the Center for European Policy Studies. Frederik Toscani is the Deputy Representative to the EU at the IMF, and Chiara Venturini, Head of Digital Transformation and Economic Development at Eurocities. Thank you all so much for being here. All right, let me just set the scene with a few words. So improving Europe's competitiveness has been a long-standing challenge, but it has come to the fore more recently, now more than ever. And competitiveness is the big buzzword that the Commission has set out for this year and for the upcoming legislature. Competitiveness, or better, the lack of competitiveness is currently being mirrored very much in the underwhelming growth performance of the EU. Basically, since the financial crisis, since around 2010, growth has been in the EU has been lacking and has been very much behind Europe's global competitors, particularly that of the US. And while some of this can certainly be attributed to problems with demographics that we face, a large part of that is also due to much deeper structural problems and lack of productivity of labor and capital. And historically speaking, we had strong external demand and low import costs, which have helped keep or maintain Europe's competitive edge. But we've seen the pandemic and subsequent energy crisis, global supply disruptions, and everything that happened after the war on Ukraine, changing the global landscape dramatically. Now we witness the fragmented geopolitical world and increased uncertainty, which both have highlighted Europe's strong dependence on external demand. And all that is worsening Europe's growth performance even further. Not to sound too dramatic, but on the flip side, and despite of all these challenges, Europe has very strong fundamentals, or the EU, and which it can and it should leverage in order to accelerate growth. And in this regard, a major achievement and the grand asset of European integration is the single market. Now with external pressures mounting a lot, Europe is increasingly relying on it, or turning inwards and relying on its internal strength. And that means leveraging the single market. But that comes with major implications, as John will explain to us in a bit, for convergence within the EU, which is already on the string, and this is has also huge implications for the European regional policy and cohesion policy in particular, which has historically always offset basically these divergence forces of the single market. Cohesion policy is already becoming, so to speak, the Swiss army knife of policy for the EU, because it has to cater to so many different goals right now, because the EU is structurally and institutionally very much constrained to in its ability to respond to crisis and acute growth problems that it's facing adequately. Why cohesion policy has to cater to so many goals? I mean, it's because where the money is, structural funds, and there are the resources to address common problems, and now the EU must basically prioritize and clearly define the goals of cohesion policy in the upcoming legislature. And amongst all these challenges that cohesion policy is addressing, one particular goal should be growth. We should ask ourselves, or the EU should ask herself, should cohesion policy play a role in growth? We argue that it should, and that cities should play a pivotal part in that growth, because that is where the largest growth potentials for economic expansion within the single market in the future are to be found. So with that, I'm happy to hand it over to John. He's going to give us a brief summary of the paper, its main findings and recommendations, and then afterwards we give our speakers the opportunity for a short intervention, and then we head to the discussion.
Why don't I stand here and then I can gesticulate. So if you just wait for this slide to come up. Can everybody hear me out now? No headphones.
No. Here.
Is it working? Okay, great. Cool. So we'll just put the slides up. So yes, thank you very much, Lucas. I've been tasked with giving a quick summary of the paper, which I'm going to try and do in 5 minutes. We'll see how that goes.
Some of your time.
No, not at all. So next slide, please, Jordan. So this is in a nutshell. You can just take a photo of this and then just switch off if you want. So basically the argument is, as Lucas says, growth within the single market has been pointed out by Letta and Draghi as something that we can do to drive more growth as the European Union as a whole. And what we've done is we have used a new data set to examine goods and services trade between regions within the single market to try and identify some growth opportunities, and also looked at to what extent is trade in goods and services driving convergence or divergence between regions of the EU. We identify the services sector as the one with the biggest growth potential, but it tends to fuel divergence between regions. And so we argue that if the EU does manage to integrate services markets more through capital markets, banking union, services delivered online, so forth, then the forces of divergence that creates is going to require it to make some reforms to cohesion policy. And we argue that a city strategy should be the one to go. So next slide, please. So this chart shows goods and services trade within the single market, which is the solid lines, and then the dotted lines are globally. And obviously, trade globally is much higher, but we've set it on 2 axes so that they kind of sit over the top of one another. And what you can see is that goods trade, which is the top one, the blue line, this is goods exports between countries within the single market. It's been kind of tracking in terms of growth, goods market integration globally. So it's hard to argue, I think, that the single market now is a major contributor to growth. If it were, then we would expect goods exports within the single market to be growing faster than global exports. That is not the case with services. If you look at services, which is the bottom line, then it's been growing much faster than global exports of services within the single market. And it's risen from about 1/3 of goods exports in 2012 to about 50% by 2022. So we're seeing, much more rapid integration in services than in goods. And one of the things that we wonder about is why there's quite so much obsession with manufacturing competitiveness globally when services are obviously something which is a growth opportunity. Can we take the next slide? I think you've gone forward too. Thank you. So goods trade integration we've seen has not really been any faster within the single market than the rest of the world, but there have been shifts. And this chart is a gravity model of the type, dare I say it, made famous in the Brexit wars. Basically, a gravity model of trade looks at how much trade one would expect given to countries or regions or towns or whatever, how rich they are. Richer countries trade more. How distant they are. Distant countries trade less. And how populous they are. If there are lots of people, then you tend to trade more. And we've applied this to regions within the EU using a new data set. Dark blue lines show 2008. The green lines show 2018. And what we see is that goods exports have become more strongly associated with lower GDP over time. You can see that on the left-hand side that we've had a movement down from about 0 to a little bit less, and also that we can see that less populous regions have also been exporting more within the single market, exporting more goods within the single market. And there's a fairly obvious explanation for this, which is that manufacturing companies are always seeking cheaper land and labour as a location for their manufacturing plants, and we've seen that in the globalization process generally. But it's also true within the EU. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see what the consequences of that are, which is that we've had extremely strong forces of convergence between East and West. If you look at the right-hand two pillars, this shows the share of intra-EU goods exports, which is done by different regions. And on the right, we can see Poland and the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. And we can see that their lines are going up quite rapidly, with a static picture or a falling picture in Western and Southern Europe. However, if we move on to next slide, services is a rather different story. Again, 2008 is dark blue and 2018 is green. And if we just look at we just concentrate on the left-hand side here, the very left-hand side, then we can see this is GDP for high knowledge services. So to what extent does a region's exports of services, is it associated with having a high GDP? We can see in 2008, pretty high, loads higher than in goods. And by 2018, if anything, I mean, it's pretty close, but we've been seeing a strengthening of richer regions being the places, or regions with the biggest GDPs being the places where more service export activity happens. And these regions are largely extremely rich cities. If we move on to the next slide. The other thing that we've done is a principal components analysis, which is basically just a fancy way of finding out correlations between regional exports and all sorts of other characteristics, like how many knowledge workers there are, does it have good governance, what are its transport interconnections like, and so forth. And what we find is that over our period, 2008 to 2018, we see a strengthening of the correlations between being a high value knowledge services exporter, if you're a region, and having knowledge workers, good transport interconnections, indicators of good governance, such as do respondents to surveys say that corruption is limited in their region, for example, and high R&D, both public and business. So in a way, this adds to our story that generally services trade strengthens forces of divergence within the EU, because you're ending up with some of the most successful cities, which are already the best governed, which already have most of the graduate workers, who tend to have better governance, have higher R&D spending. They're the ones that are most likely to win out. Next slide. So finally, you can also just take a picture of this if you want. This is why we think we need a reformed cohesion policy, because a lot of cities which are in the second tier and which aren't Warsaw, Lisbon, these capital cities which are now doing extremely well in services exports, they're struggling more. Either because they have suffered from deindustrialization, or because they don't have enough graduate workers, or perhaps they don't have enough institutions which are going to attract businesses. So our argument is, let's make some reforms to cohesion policy to try and allow them to take more advantage of this growth opportunity which services trade provides. So we think more regional funds should be distributed towards city regions with high growth potential. The EU and member states should identify some particular cities that have this potential in each member state, which tend to be second tier cities. Some examples are Krakow, Leipzig, Valencia. The EU can take some money out of some ineffective budget lines like the classic common agricultural policy and spend it on improving these cities' transport, energy and other infrastructure. And this will have the tendency to make these cities more efficient. And also by making them denser, and their labour markets larger, by having bigger transport interconnections, then you should improve matches between workers' skills and the skills that employers need, and that should raise productivity. This should be done in concert with city, regional and national governments, and they should also contribute funds and planning capability. The EU and national governments should try and put some regulatory institutions and universities and R&D centres in these cities where possible. And we highlight the fact that the European Banking Authority went to Paris and the European Medicines Agency went to Amsterdam as examples of things that could have been done differently. And finally, this is a politically difficult thing to do, obviously, because as Lucas said at the beginning, there's a redistributive element to cohesion policy. And so there are difficult trade-offs to be made here. And it's also that you're supplementing a rules-based system where you're saying we are going to fund predominantly regions which fall below a threshold, i.e. 75% of the EU average GDP, and try and move them towards a more discretionary system where funds are allocated based upon a judgment about whether a place has a lot of growth potential. So we put this as a kind of provocative sketch of what could be done, and I'd be delighted to hear what the rest of our panel thinks of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. After that, I'm going to give now our speakers the opportunity for a brief intervention on the paper and to hear their thoughts on our findings and specific recommendations. I think I'll start with you, Peter. Given your experience in regional policy and regional policy making, what messages do you draw from the report for the role of cohesion policy in the future? Do you think the city-led reform of cohesion policy is the right approach to enhance growth? And if so, what are the political obstacles for such a strategy? And do you think they could be unsurmountable?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the presentation and the report, which is provocative but very stimulating, and I think it comes at a very important time. I think the first point I'd like to make, and it's something which I think we particularly appreciate about the report, is it highlights the fact that Europe is not flat, that there is a territorial dimension to the question of competitiveness, and particularly when we look at debates in the US as well, and other parts of the world. We think that this has to be part of the discussion on where Europe's growth model is going. So I'll start with some points where I think on the analysis in the report, I think we share your views. I think the first thing is the need to be much more focused in on the opportunities for the tradable services. This has not always been part of the kind of the regional development language, but of course, you'd expect me to say this. We shouldn't abandon manufacturing, particularly in critical technologies. Now, there are messages in there which are actually quite in tune with what the cohesion report, which was recently published, says, and the central role of metropolitan areas, the cities and surroundings in driving growth. I mean, I think this is something which we agree on. But I mean, perhaps we also have to think about the externalities of growth, particularly in the very largest cities. And I think the other thing which we're very much in tune is the role of small towns and medium-sized cities play in economic development more generally. And I think this for us kind of touches on really one of the key issues that the Commission has to look at in the next legislature, is how do we simultaneously increase our external competitiveness while not fundamentally undermining our internal cohesion. And I think you just have to look at the European elections and other elections recently to see that this is a real issue. Now, on cohesion policy, unsurprisingly, I mean, there are a few points where we don't really see entirely eye to eye with you. I think the first thing, and this is something which we see very often, cohesion policy is not about transfers. I mean, it may have been about transfers a long time ago, but through successive MFF, I mean, it is really a policy about creating growth through supply side improvements and the delivery of public goods, particularly in relation to environmental services and in regions which do not have their own financing capacity to do this on its own. And this serves the internal market and the EU as a whole. The second thing is, I think, just on the point of manufacturing, I think that certainly, cohesion policy has contributed to increased investment in Central Eastern Europe in manufacturing, but this has been mainly through infrastructure and training. The key driver for manufacturing convergence has been FDI, and cohesion policy has been a facilitator of that. And the focus on cohesion policy for the private sector has been essentially innovation, small businesses. And I think that although there's a debate ongoing, particularly in relation to STEP, about larger enterprises, there has always been this very strong focus on endogenous growth. Then I think another area just where I would take a bit issue with you is that there is a very strong urban focus in cohesion policy already. I think probably, depending on the methodology, use between 85 and 75% of cohesion policy funds go to urban areas. I mean, some of those are peri-urban, but on the heavily urbanized areas, probably a good third of the policies already in there. And all of the cities you mentioned have benefited extensively from cohesion policy support. So just to perhaps say then, just to conclude, that messages we take from the report and we think that are very interesting. The first thing is, yes, small and medium-sized cities will be key to increased competitiveness and at the same time strengthening internal cohesion. So I think there, you are spot on this. And I think one of the areas where perhaps we could do better is to focus in terms of the interventions we do in cities more clearly on competitiveness and linkages within the single market. Now, whether we have to touch the balance of resources within the programs, we're not entirely convinced. On the other hand, there's a question of what you use the resources for. And I think that there could be a refocusing of the resources. And I think it's a point you make in the report, and you mentioned very briefly, but there are also areas of issues of capacity and potential reforms, which are important. And I think one of the key issues that we are thinking about, and I think echoes your report, is we have to rethink a bit the way in which we approach the use of our resources within cities in the future, particularly in the light of discussions on having a more performance-based policy. Now, just to finish, I just wanted to say you can't take cohesion policy in isolation. I mean, we can do all of this, but if we don't complete capital markets union, banking union, address national barriers to new entrants, reduce and address skills shortages, strengthen our presence in critical technologies, the potential scope for the kind of agglomeration economies that you're talking about will be very, very shrunk. And I think they're at the level of the Commission, and there are two things that we need to reflect on. The first thing, of course, is to think about the role of cities in other policies. And I think there is a clear issue of fragmentation within the Commission and EU policies of the approach to cities. And I think this is something that this next Commission could reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think I'll hand it over to Chiara. We would like to hear also your thoughts on the reports, and something that Peter touched upon is that there is already apparently a very strong urban dimension in cohesion policy. We know that there's a strong vocal emphasis on that. I would like to hear maybe also from your side or to expand maybe on the relationship between EU policies and cities. Do you agree on that? Is there already a strong enough urban dimension in cohesion policy?
Well, I mean, yeah, I hope you can hear me. I was very happy to see that you're arguing for more direct involvement of cities and a more direct say of cities in deciding how funding is allocated. I think when I was reading the executive summary of the report, I put a big yes next to the paragraph that says more direct funding and more direct say. I think at the same time, echoing what Peter said, it's not just about more funding, I think. It's also about a better allocation of the funding that exists. And I'm not just talking about, although as somebody who lives in Brussels, I know what happens when you try to take money away from the farmers. So I would like to see somebody try, just out of curiosity. But it's also because there is funding today that remains on the table. And that is not because cities do not want to apply for that funding, but because they lack the internal capacity. Sometimes the rules are too complex. Sometimes we speak with the EIB, for instance, and we see that a lot of the funding they have for climate adaptation in particular remains on the table. Sometimes the projects they finance are too large. And so cities, although that sounds paradoxical, would like to borrow smaller sums of money and they can't. So I think making the rules a little more flexible and a little more adapted to what city needs are can already deliver a lot. So it is not just about finding new sources of funding. The other thing related to that, where we would like to see some more action at EU level, is potentially looking at more flexibility in the application of some rules. So cities that invest extensively in climate adaptation projects, for instance, have argued that those investments might be taken out of the calculations for the 3% deficit rules. In other cases, there is more direct funding that cities would give to the local to support the local economy, and they can't do that because of state aid rules. So we might also look at the regulatory framework and try to reflect on that. The last thing I want to mention now is we currently have over 200 members from 34 European countries, because we cover Europe not just from a political but in a geographical sense of the term. So we have members that are in different regions, in different contexts. And for us, we also need to take into account this sort of tension between cooperation on one hand and competition on the other hand, because we know that there is also that. We help our members support the local ecosystems. And at the same time, we know that they can't all do the same thing and all become a tech hub with the same type of skills profiles and try to steal talent from one another. So there is also this aspect, I think, that should be taken into account.
Yes, thank you very much. Cinzia, yeah, we would like also to hear your thoughts on the report and which lessons you draw from it. And also, do you think, we spoke before a bit about the difference between absolute convergence and steady state convergence, maybe you can also go into that. Do you think that the EU or the EU regional policy should put less emphasis on absolute convergence and maybe help regions lift their potentials to converge towards their own steady state?
Thanks a lot. First of all, many thanks for inviting me. It was really a pleasure to read the piece. It really made me think a lot, and so I'll try to share really some thoughts and some reflections. I actually want to start with one of the questions that John asked. What is the obsession with manufacturing? So I think this was actually also my starting point. So I was really pleased to see the focus on services and the distinction between goods and services. I think this was much due. In fact, I think it is something that it started 2019 to say, look, we need to focus more on services. But then COVID came, we had disruption in supply chains, and we started to be obsessed with the lack of access to physical goods. And then the global environment changed, and we realized that we depend very much on certain countries when it comes to certain goods or some physical resources. So I think this deviated quite a bit the attention from services. But the reality is that even in manufacturing, the role of services, so the content service of manufacturing has increased incredibly. So the manufacturing sector is not only about goods. If you think in terms of value, if you think of software design, for instance, this is something that it determines the highest value of a mobile phone. So even if you think of a mobile phone as a good, a lot of the value is related to services. So I think your emphasis on services is very much reflecting the reality. And I think if we think in this direction, it also makes us think why actually the potential for growth is much more on services than in physical goods. I mean, I don't want to say that physical goods are not important, but in terms of potential, I think this is quite important. Now, that said, when I read the conclusions of the report, I thought, okay, these guys are really bold because I mean, moving away from regions as the unit, the administrative unit we care about when we think of cohesion and thinking of cities, I said, okay, that's quite a big change. And then I started to reflect actually on why we have started to think about regions, why cohesion policy is actually based on regions. And maybe some people in the room can correct me, but my understanding is that if we think of the EU at the beginning, so the big countries, the big old EU member states are all characterized by multi-level governance in which regions are very powerful. Huh? And this is actually quite different from new member states, Eastern European member states. I mean, some of these countries have 1 or 2 regions, so if we look in terms of NATS. So this idea of allocating funds based on regions somehow was reflecting much more the administrative or the governance structure of all member states than of new member states. Related to this sorry, I want to go back to something else. With that in mind, again, if I'm not mistaken, the Just Transition Fund, I think it uses actually NUTS 3 as allocation unit instead of NUTS 2, because it's much more directed to certain communities or certain areas which are more exposed to certain risks. So my point is that maybe the evolution of the challenges that we are facing are directing us to a more granular approach when it comes to the identification of the challenges and potentially to the allocation of the funds. So again, I think it's quite bold. This would be a major change, but I also understand that there are some ongoing changes which may lead us to think of more towards cities rather than towards regions. Now, my second comment is broader, and again, it relates to the conclusions. And my reading is that your suggestion is basically to pick winners. So maybe you see where I'm going, and this makes me think of industrial policy. I mean, if you think of industrial policy in a broad sense, this can be different form of support, regulatory support or money, but it implies that the government decides to allocate money to a company, a sector or a region to give an advantage to it. So it's basically picking the winners. So this made me think of two aspects. First, do we want to change cohesion into industrial policy? Question mark. Second point, what we know from industrial policy is that you may want to choose your winners, to pick your winners, assessing whether they have a comparative advantage. Because that's basically the only way to ensure that you don't need to give them money in eternity. And that basically the fact that you give an advantage will turn into high productivity, high growth. And therefore this make me really think how can we square this approach with the fundamental principles of cohesion, and whether this is fundamentally calling for a major rethinking of cohesion. Can I just add one last point? So thinking of cohesion, again, if my reading is from your paper is correct, is that you are not really saying let's scrap everything, we start from scratch and we allocate all the money from cohesion to few cities. So the idea is really maybe to introduce some form of flexibility into cohesion. I call it flexibility because we are currently working with some colleagues at SEPS on this idea of whether we can have some inbuilt flexibility in cohesion. So our thinking is that we may see a major change in cohesion policy, but it may also be the case that we will not see a major transformation of cohesion policy. However, because of the crisis we experience and the higher frequency of shocks, because of the increased number of priorities or demand for EU money to be allocated for all the priorities, I think we really need to start to think of whether we can have some inbuilt flexibility so that if it is needed, if we agreed that all the priorities needs to be considered, maybe some money needs to be reallocated. And this should be done in the smoothest possible way. And maybe I will stop it here, but it's thanks very much for the paper and inviting me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we'll get back to the reallocation aspect very soon. But now, last but not least, Frederik, give us also your thoughts on the paper, and maybe we can also take a step back and you can start us off, or basically finish this panel basically with the big picture implications of the lack of growth in the EU and what policies could get it going again, and how can the single market in particular help with that?
Thanks very much. Thanks also for the invitation. Also really enjoyed reading the paper. Okay, so then I'll take 2-3 minutes to do that big picture thing, and I can be that'll be more or less official IMF, and then I'll speak on the paper in personal capacity. Okay, maybe as the starting point, I mean, you mentioned it, no, but like a good benchmark is, I guess, this gap with the US. So the EU has a third lower GDP per capita roughly than the US. And then all the big reports at the moment kind of go into that. One interesting thing is if you look at what exactly that gap is made up of, I mean, there were maybe some controversial FT articles also that there's a labor component. No, Europeans just don't work enough. But actually, that's kind of a smallish component of it. The really 70% roughly is a difference in productivity. So it's not, the issue is not hours worked or how many people work. It's really the productivity of work. It goes across many sectors, but clearly the tech sector also plays quite a big role in this kind of post-GFC dynamic. Okay, what can be done? And we fully agree, deepening the single market further is probably one of the key things, if not the most important thing. I think it's important to acknowledge also that a lot has been done, no? So every next step is incrementally going to be more difficult. Not less important, but I think it's an important reality also to be aware of. I mean, we had colleagues had a paper recently where they estimate that reducing remaining barriers by 10% could give something like 7 percentage point higher GDP. Okay, big numbers, and it's kind of a very big picture approach, but let's say it's going to be significant either way, no? And what's below the kind of remaining frictions, certainly services are really important. No? That you show some actually really cool graphs on that services has been growing quite a bit. Nevertheless, in terms of the remaining pie of what can be done, that's clearly where much of the action is. And then maybe to a tiny parenthesis, because you touch on it on the paper, the sort of that Europe both innovates and produces, and you talk about how these two got delinked. But that's a really big strength now also in the context of kind of global fragmentation. So really deepening the single market can both help productivity, but also help resilience. No, if you bring together these different pieces in a more fragmented world, that builds your resilience. Okay, maybe one final big picture point on CMU, just because you also mentioned it explicitly in the paper and in the intro. So, you know, most welcome kind of recent political push. So we hope it leads to concrete developments, and really key for growth. And just to highlight one angle, which is venture capital, we have a mini advertisement on a forthcoming paper on that. But I mean, one status fact is the European venture capital funds raise about 1/10 of what they do in the US. And there's quite a lot of evidence that, especially in these kind of tech sectors, that's really like something that's missing in the European ecosystem. Okay, then just to conclude, I mean, 2 thoughts out in the paper. So the first one was exactly Cinzia's last point. So I thought this picking winners can be tricky. We know it can be tricky, but on the other hand, you know, like it's going back to the industrial policy analogy, industrial policy doesn't have to be picking winners. Now you can have kind of competitive mechanisms within industrial policy. So why not have something, use that analogy here as well, no? So, and then maybe it can be less discretionary also. Because even accepting kind of the prerogative, my second point, but the question was that once you have this much discretion and only a handful of the political economy, seems really difficult to me. I don't know what your thoughts were on concretely now, what kind of mechanisms could overcome that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. I guess we'll move on to some follow-up questions, and maybe I'll hand it to John. Maybe you want to react directly to any of the points that we heard. Yeah, we'll start from here.
Should start with me.
Sorry?
Start with me.
If you have any questions.
Yeah. Hello. I just thought that was absolutely fantastic set of comments, which are incredibly helpful. I just wanted to respond to just a couple of maybe one point from each person, just briefly. I absolutely agree, Peter, that the aim is, I mean, there is a redistributive aim in the sense that resources are explicitly transferred to regions which are not succeeding as much. And the aim of that is to try and allow them to take more advantage of the market. And so obviously that means investing in the supply side is what's going on. But I suppose one of the some of the literature that we cite in the paper has found that by exploiting the fact that when a region goes from having 70, being 74% the level of the EU average, and then tips over into 80%, some people have studied the extent to which growth persists. So they find that structural funds have really improved growth, certainly, but they haven't necessarily found a persistent effect. And so that was one of the things that was in the back of our minds was how do we make sure that this investment leads to virtuous circles? And that's where agglomeration benefits might be helpful to think about. And on Chiara, the competitiveness between competition between cities and cooperation, I thought was a really important point. And I suppose this spills over into the point that both Cinzia and Frederik made about picking winners too. You know, if you say, well, you know, you second-tier city, you're going to get this incredibly fancy new biotechnology research institute funded by EMBL, then by definition, other cities aren't going to get it. But I guess if we think about it in terms of, you know, first tier, second tier, and smaller cities, then it would make a lot of sense to try and locate it, sure, in a city which has you know, quite good universities already, so that there is a pool of research expertise there. But it's not necessarily such a good idea on a growth basis to put it, I don't know, in, you know, an extremely small university town, for example. So yes, there's definitely problems in that industrial policy sense of picking winners, but the fact that we have quite a lot of large cities which have been struggling to find a foothold in a new services-dominated economy does suggest that you know, at least moving some functions away from already successful places might be helpful. And then, yeah, just a final point about picking winners and competitive mechanisms. I mean, maybe that is something which could be done at a, you know, at a European level, and rather than having, you know, maybe this is incredibly naive, but you could imagine at least a system where you know, some new regulatory agency or some new Horizon funded center is happening, and there's just a much more explicit and rules-based system for determining where it goes, and you know, that would prevent it essentially from being decided by political horse trading, and would allow it to be cited at least with an eye to the possibility for growth. Thanks very much.
Cinzia, you mentioned, or I mentioned in the beginning, that cohesion policy should clearly define a goal, right? Because it's catering to so many needs, and it's being basically right now what we're witnessing is being kind of picked apart because that's because it's the only larger fund that we have in the EU to address so many problems. And in the beginning I said, okay, to prevent this misallocation, we should focus on a clear goal. Now you said, quite convincing, you argued that flexibility is actually a strength in cohesion policy. And yeah, and I tend to agree with that. And if you think it a bit further, so diverting funds from cohesion policy in the sense of flexibility towards catering to new needs depends always on new insights that we get, right? And now if we have, for instance, in our report, we found out that there are lots of growth potentials in the service sector in cities, especially in post-industrial cities who are struggling. If you say, okay, cohesion policy should be more flexible, and this is a new need, this is a new insight that we have, then it would make sense to actually go there with in a flexible kind of way, right? And that again, and this is maybe then this will go into a question for Peter. This would probably mean diversion of funds, and they must come because they must come from somewhere, and there's no money on the horizon, no fresh money, I guess, right? So too many political constraints for this upcoming legislature. So where could that money come from, if not from cohesion? Could we touch agriculture, or I don't know, maybe that's a question we shouldn't discuss in Brussels.
Okay, let me, if I can, maybe also to clarify a bit. So when thinking about, so our thoughts about flexibility whether this is possible. So this is because this is a quite complex question. Starts from the assumption that it's very unlikely, or at least our assumption, working assumption, is that we won't have more money than we have today. Okay, that's I mean, basically what we expect from the new political, let's say, constellation. Let me put it this way: it's very unlikely that we will have more a bigger EU budget. Okay, maybe let's leave aside security, defense. That's a different story. But otherwise, working assumption, we are in the same situation. We will be the same situation of today. We do not enter into the issue of agricultural policy. This is extremely controversial. I mean, so what we try to do is to say, let's look at the last few years and try to map situations in which we had to resort to some form of flexibility, so somehow some form of deviation from how money was allocated at the beginning of the programming period. And we had some cases, CRI, CRI+, REACT-EU. These are situations in which, because of the crisis, some money were used in a different way than initially planned. So this is an example. And from that, we started to reflect on whether, in order to meet this demand for new EU priorities and to make sure that actually EU money is used for something that is useful to citizens, to company, to the union in general, we may use this money for in a more flexible way. But this is actually quite complicated. And it generates some dilemmas, some challenges. I mean, we know that one of the reasons why we have funds which are allocated and decided at the beginning of the programming period is to have full predictability. And we have a certain system of monitoring and control, which relies on that kind of structure. So when we start to deviate from the system that we have, the situation becomes much more complex. And so flexibility is, I think it is an option, but it comes with some challenges, including in the implementation part. So the bottom line is that we think that is something that maybe we should explore and think better, because we may end up in 2028, 2029 in having this need, and we need to be, I think we need to be prepared for that kind of situation. That said, it's not straightforward. They said, okay, let's use the flexibility that we have in cohesion policy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe to follow up on this with Peter, because you mentioned the governance aspect is highly complex, and we're facing a new programming period right now, or better, this one is coming to an end. Peter, can you give us maybe already insights on what the priority areas for the next phase of EU regional policy are looking to be? Can you give us maybe also an insight on if there's already a plan for EU cohesion policy in the next budget, or yeah, would be nice to get some insight if possible.
Well, I mean, I think this is possibly the worst time you could have asked me that question, because we are waiting for a new president, we are waiting for new political orientations, we are waiting for new commissioners. Now, that said, I mean, we had a cohesion report which was focused very much on learning the lessons. And I think it is quite clear already that there will need to be a stronger focus on competitiveness in the future. And perhaps just as an aside, I mean, that's one of the things that I like very much about this report, is that when we look at the delivery of climate or environment goals, we have quite a sophisticated apparatus for thinking about how we want to do it. When we come to the issues of growth, we don't. And I mean, we say, look, we know you should do some innovation, you should do some, make your SMEs more competitive, train some people. But we also know that the reality of growth is spatial. And I think that is one area where we would want to have a stronger focus in the future, both in terms of the kind of, whether you're talking about agglomeration, virtuous circles, but also linkages. Because if you don't have linkages, then you don't have possibilities within the single market. So that's one area. I think secondly, I mean, clearly the green transition is going to be a major area. I think as you hinted, Cinzia, I mean, this question of resilience is going to be a very important one, a kind of an ex ante resilience as opposed to an ex post resilience. And then I think there are also the social issues, the issue of social convergence, which will be major priorities. We can have a whole session on the way we deliver the policy, but I think that's not really the subject today.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a nice try. Yeah, you mentioned the social aspect, and I think what comes with that is the aspect of solidarity, because what the single market gives us a lot, and what we touch upon in the report a lot, is the importance of matching skills with demand for skills, and that happens most of the time in cities, or to the best degree in cities. But that means also brain drain, right? That means that people are leaving certain regions in order to move towards where agglomeration happens. And yeah, my question maybe to you, Chiara, this principle of solidarity, we've spoken about this before. How can we upheld this in regional policy, in European regional policy that is focused on cities, but wants also to guarantee the freedom to stay that Letta mentioned, for instance, in this report.
Yes, I've got about an hour and a half to answer this question, right? Okay, so so I think there are a lot of different aspects connected to this, but to just start from what we advocate at Eurocities, so a people-centric digital and green transformation, to echo what Peter said about the twin transition, which is obviously going to remain one of the key priorities, if nothing else, because climate change is not something we can just shelve and try to forget about. So there is an aspect of skills are needed to make this transition happen. And so this requires efforts at the education level. It requires effort to attract and retain talent. And this needs resources for that to happen. So when we talk about, there is also the aspect that the job market is going to change. It is already changing. It is difficult for cities to completely anticipate what the effect on certain categories of jobs of digitalization, of AI and robotics will be. And so it makes it difficult to anticipate what kind of response they can put together. It doesn't mean that it cannot be done. The City of London has interesting programs with trade unions on up and reskilling, for instance, but a lot more is needed in the first place to just have an idea of how the situation is going to look like on the ground. Then there is the question of talent attraction and retaining. We know that Europe is, demographically speaking, an old continent. We know that migration policies in member states at the moment have taken a turn towards restriction. That also has an impact, because cities can have the most attractive talent attraction policy, but if that clashes with restriction on immigration policy that they have no leverage on, that is going to hamper the quest for talent. And so, for instance, another example from one of our members, the City of Glasgow has a really interesting program that channels graduates into the local job market, but they don't have a say on the level, the income threshold that is needed for people to apply for work visas. And those income thresholds are calculated on the basis of the cost of living in London, which is much higher than Glasgow. And so these people who would perfectly be able to hold a job and maintain themselves in Glasgow do not get visas because they fail to meet the income threshold. So all of this needs to be addressed. The other thing for city administrations is that in some cases, they also lack internally the skills they need. And this is particularly the case in the digital sector. Because the private sector has historically been a lot more attractive for people with this type of skills. In general, we also see that a city administration public career is not something that is considered particularly attractive in general, but especially in the digital sector. And so that creates a dearth of skills. We have cities that when they want to contract digitally based public services face challenges even at the point of writing the technical specifications for the tender, evaluating the quality of the proposals they receive. And so that is also something that we need to work on. You touch on capacity building in your report, which I think is very positive, because that is one of the areas where we also need support.
Lots of great points. Thank you. Maybe before we hit it to the Q&A and open the stage for your questions and the questions online, I would like to ask Frederik. You mentioned the lack of productivity and lack of innovation that we have in Europe, and also and you said the Capital Markets Union could help with that, and you mentioned it briefly. What else in the single market are tools tools at disposal within the single market that could help with more innovate? And maybe I'm echoing Enrico Letta with that: more innovate, less regulate. So it's cutting red tape and sector fragmentations might play a part in that. But is there anything else? And especially what could be the role of cities in that regard?
All right, thanks a lot. I mean, maybe, okay, to complement the capital point, no, the kind of single labor unions probably complete in terms of kind of the freedom to move, but not really de facto in terms of, I mean, just taking one thing, the portability of pensions, no? Once you've started to accumulate a pension somewhere, your incentive to move somewhere else, even if it might be attractive for other kind of reasons, diminishes drastically if that means you would lose what you've accumulated so far. No, there's much more that can be done there, and actually it also plays into CMU. It's kind of part of the agenda. And then on services, kind of well aware of kind of some closed professions. No, so there's kind of legal hurdles or small administrative hurdles that mean many potentially tradable services are de facto not really that tradable. And then maybe the last one on energy. I mean, the shock recently kind of put it front of mind, and actually, I mean, Europe showed really great solidarity actually, and kind of the single market helped a lot. No, the whole system was built to bring gas east to west, and it was a huge effort to reorient it in just a year to make it flow west to east. So kind of a great success, but at the same time, there's not yet the sort of total energy union that Europe will also need for the green transition. I'm just thinking grids, you know, there's lots to do on infrastructure, for example.
Great. I think given the time that we have left, maybe we go to the Q&A, and John will have the pleasure of moderating that.
Yeah, I've got the computer here. So anybody online, if you can hear me, please, I've got the chat function up here. So you can, oh, we've got some questions already. Great. Okay. Oh my, loads of questions. Okay, great. So I will put some of those to the panel. Would anybody who's actually here like to ask a question? Gentleman here, and then I'll come to one of the questions from the webinar chat.
Thank you. My name is Paul Smith. I'm curious from a leadership perspective. A lot of the details that you're describing cover many areas, but I didn't hear any mention leadership. How important is local leadership, either local mayors or strong local councils, to the success of a city? And if they are important, how do you factor that in?
Chiara, do you want to take that one?
Yes, sure. Just on remote chance, any of our mayors is watching. Mayors are super important, but no, I think there is two aspects to that. One is that political leadership is indeed the one that gives the strategic direction. So when you have mayors and councils that are really behind green objectives and digital transformation, and that most importantly are behind enhancing citizen participation and buy-in in public policies, that is really super important. The other component that I was mentioning earlier is the capacity in city administrations, because mayors and councils come and go. The political color of a city administration can change, but once you have good people with good expertise in place that can ensure continuity in the city work, then that is also extremely important, I think, in the implementation. So it's, if you want, it's a little bit the old thing you hear in business school about the leader is the one that inspires you to get somewhere, and the manager is the one who gets you there. So I think both are equally important.
United States, it's the innovation country. Okay, it's easy to bring a product on the market and the market adjusts the product, I would say. Here, you go through a very long process before your product is accepted. So that makes a big difference to first productivity, because I wanted just to make that comment, because yes, so remove much of the bureaucracy in Europe and you have more productivity in Europe. Okay.
Well, I was just wondering if I could put sort of that, the point that Frederik made, and perhaps, in the sense of you can have a much more red in tooth and claw form of capitalism, such as this, where and you can have a Silicon Valley where you end up with huge agglomerations, but as Frederik says, then you end up with much more questions about distribution and cohesion that arise out of that. I mean, do you accept? I mean, because this is also a fundamental trade-off within our paper. Really, we say that we think this is a bit of a trade-off. Do you think that there is a trade-off?
Maybe I can react.
Yeah.
So actually, I think that there is a major trade-off. So, okay, maybe before thinking of a European Silicon Valley, if we think of concrete example of agglomeration in Europe, I think Paris is actually a good example, Paris and France, where you really have very high concentration of value creation in just one city. And this has been accompanied actually by huge congestion costs. This is, if you think of economic geography, if you think of housing, so sorry, it's just inaccessible. It's you have a good job and you can't afford to have a house. Huh? So, and this has become one of the source of discontent in France. So let's be honest. So it's not only about the regions where growth has been lower that feel lagging behind. It's also the people in basically a big city. You are somehow part of the production process of the value creation, but you are not really enjoying the distribution of the value that you are participating in. And this is, I think, it's becoming extremely frustrating. Huh? Now, so this is somehow the cost side. Then on the other side, we know that agglomeration is important for value creation, and especially in a digital economy, because technological innovation and digital transformation are associated with huge economy of scales in terms of knowledge. So actually, the more you're concentrated, the more you grow and create the economy of scales. And this, I think, it's the major trade-off. So from an economic point of view and value creation, you want to be more concentrated and agglomerate. From a social point of view and distribution of the benefits, you don't want this. This is, I think, is really the fundamental trade-off that we need to resolve.
Very interesting points. Any further questions from the floor? Okay, yes, sir, yeah.
Hi, thanks. I'm just Owen from the Martin Centre. It's the EPP think tank. Very interesting report. And I think, we could all generally agree with its conclusions, but I think what is interesting is that perhaps the unintended, social or political consequences. Cinzia just mentioned housing. Housing is the housing availability, or the lack of housing availability and affordability is a key drag on labour mobility. I think based on a recent survey, 35% of firms dependent on FDI in Dublin now have to offer housing support as a part of their relocation package to attract staff. So I think possibly that housing is, and I know it's mentioned in your report, but possibly I think that, you know, I would have expected to see a much bigger focus on that. My last point very quickly is that it comes down, I think, as well to administrative capacity in the smaller cities. You know, there's a reason why the City of London is still the biggest financial centre in the world, long after Britain, you know, lost its title. And I think we should. Your report made me laugh when I saw, you know, it was a pity that the European Medicines Agency went to Amsterdam, which, you know, I agree with. It should have, you know, it should have went to somewhere slightly different. But I'm not sure if you'd get maybe 1,000 well-paid bureaucrats who are used to living in London to move to Krakow, because there is a different political and social, you know, consequence to that, particularly if you move 10 or 15 kilometers outside of downtown Krakow, which is going to be a significantly different political context than, you know, Mayfair or Piccadilly or whatever in London. Thanks.
All good points. Any further comments? Be happy to come back to that in a bit, unless Lucas wants to. Did you want to make any comments in response to?
Perhaps we have more questions. I'm sure they will cover.
Okay, fine. Well, I mean, just in response to that, I mean, I completely agree with that. One of the key things that we say, though, which maybe didn't come across in the presentation quite enough, is that densification is one way that you can resolve these kinds of, not resolve them, but you can at least ameliorate some of these trade-offs. And obviously there are some bads that go along with that. I mean, you know, you're going to have a lot of high rise. But, you know, if you want to create cities which have much larger labour markets and better matching, and therefore higher productivity, then densification is something that can really help. And that should help with housing costs. I mean, the other point, of course, is that there's distributional issues when it comes to housing costs that are really important, in the sense that a lot of this is also driven by interest rates having been so low for so long, and so you've ended up with prices, asset values going up so much. Maybe we're going to have a period of higher interest rates, which might help with that a little bit. But certainly for somewhere like Dublin, City of London, Paris, then it's, you know,
there's lots of environmental trade-offs there.
There are indeed, yes. Any further questions in the room? No. Okay. We've got a question online, which I've just managed to lose, which is there a role for the rule of law and justice in this story? And I guess certainly in terms of cohesion policy, this is an interesting question for Peter. You know, rule of law and the attempt to try and at least tie some elements of EU funding to respect for the rule of law has been something which has happened. And I mean, the biggest conditionality has been over the RRF, I guess, really. But do you think that this is going to continue? Are there any plans to make it stronger? What's that think?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, following the discussions recently on this, you know, this has become kind of part of the discussion on the EU budget in general. I mean, of course, there was a strong rule of law discussion in the context of the RRF, but there was also a similar type of discussion in relation to the protection of fundamental rights in relation to the Charter in the context of cohesion policy. So just to say, my feeling is that, you know, I mean, there's a kind of a ratchet often in policies, and I think some form of rule of law conditionality is likely to be here to stay.
Okay, wonderful. Well, if there are no further questions, please. So let's wait for the microphone, just so that the people online can hear you.
Yes, I am a startup in Brussels, and my question is related to the role of AI in single market. What will be the role of AI?
What will be the role of AI in the
Because
single
we are
market?
in the age of AI now.
Yeah. Would anyone like to take that? Maybe Frederik?
Perhaps
Yeah, he says.
I can come in this. I mean, I think this is I would say within the service sector, and that's at the higher value added end is one of the biggest issues for the EU. We just had AI office set up, which is supposed to be another one of our one-stop shops to deal with issues. And I think that in this next commission, it will be even higher up the agenda to see, for a number of reasons. I mean, it's a strategic technology, but also how we can facilitate its growth. I think from our perspective, in the cohesion policy side, there are a lot of questions because we see there's already work coming out on this. I mean, the work is focused more on automation now, but I think we're seeing also some work on the very asymmetric impact of AI. And I think that one of the questions will be to ensure that the costs and benefits are addressed in a way which allows a smooth transition. Because I mean, what is interesting about AI is it's not like manufacturing. I mean, it is going to hit places in different ways compared to the classical industrial restructuring that we may have seen over the last 50 years. So I think for us, this will certainly be a focus to reflect on, and the necessary skilling of people, but also helping companies, because I think in Europe there are significant barriers to the uptake of AI in SMEs because there are significant barriers and reluctance in terms just of digital processes and management techniques. So I think it's a really big issue.
Sorry, I wanted to.
Chiara, do you want to go first and then Cinzia?
Just quickly, I think this is not just valid for AI, but I think technology in general. It seems to me that sometimes we tend into going after the trends, and so it was all about blockchain, and then it was all about cryptocurrency, and now it's all about AI. I think it is more useful to start from the problem or the challenge that you want to solve, and then ask yourself, does AI address that problem, or do I need to look for another type of solution? So in a city, you ask yourself, what are my challenges? Do I need to make my waste management collection more efficient? Do I want to make the process of applying for public housing simpler for people? Do I want to improve my cultural offering for people with disabilities and people whose first language is not the language of the city? And then once you have identified your challenge, you ask yourself, what kind of technological solution can meet those challenges? How do I tailor it? Because if you just add a layer of technology on top of something, just because that is the latest buzzword, that's not going to work very well, I think.
Cinzia.
Yeah, maybe just some thoughts. I mean, of course, AI is something which is pervasive. So it's basically it's touching upon all different aspects of life. So it's not obvious to think about it in a systematic way. One simple way, it's rather simplistic, but I think the two main areas on which AI is going to have an impact is, of course, on the production side. And I think we really need to have an understanding of how the industrial ecosystems are going to be affected by artificial intelligence, and in particular, how this can drive higher productivity, and how can Europe be in a leading position, basically competing with the United States and China. So this is really on the production side. And actually the geographical dimension is going to be key. I'm quite convinced about this. The second element, I think, is the labor market. And there, I think we are still in a situation of unknown. That's a bit my impression. But there are quite a lot of transformations that are going on, not only in the way production is organized. Somehow we can think of AI as an enhanced automation, but also in the way organizations are rethinking their structures and the way some for instance, managerial functions are now taken over by artificial intelligence. What this means for organizations, but also for workers. And then another aspect is really about the demand for skills, and to what extent certain kind of skills or new skills are in demand, whether these are new skills that before were not necessarily available and in demand. And maybe a step further is whether the combination of the complementarity between certain specific digital or AI-driven skills interact with other skills like public speaking, like emotional skills, like empathy. So the very human skills, which cannot be replaced by a machine. So it's more question marks than answer, but I think we need to think about it in a and we need to break down the whole issue, because otherwise we won't be able actually to identify the challenges and to come up with policy solutions.
Well, great. I mean, I think that's just about us on time, unless Frederik, you want to say anything about AI? Okay. And just to say thank you so much to our speakers, Chiara, Frederik, Cinzia, and Peter. I thought it was really, really helpful, because I don't know about you, but yeah, they were really helpful and thoughtful comments, which I think, you know, maybe we need to write another little blog or something.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have got some really nice follow-up ideas. Thank you to this great panel. I think that was a nice round with diverse angles and opinions on the topic. And I think, yeah, complex indeed, bold as well. But I think we found lots of common ground, and one thing stands for sure. I think cohesion policy, one way or the other, will have to adapt against these new realities, also within the single market. Yes, thank you all for being here, also to the audience and the audience at home. And it was a pleasure. Thank you.